Picture this. It is a bright afternoon in the spring of 1953, on a small crescent of sand called Halona Cove, on the eastern shore of the island of Oahu in Hawaii. The Pacific is very blue, the sun is very high, and a tall, powerfully built man of 39 is standing in the surf, waist deep in the water, waiting for the next wave. His name is Burt Lancaster. He is, at this exact moment, one of the most recognizable movie stars in America. In a few minutes, a film crew is going to point a camera at him, and he is going to gather a woman into his arms. The woman is Deborah Kerr, and the two of them are going to kiss while the Pacific Ocean crashes over both of them. That kiss will become, quite literally, one of the most famous images in the history of American cinema. The film is called From Here to Eternity. It will win 8 Academy Awards. And that shot at Halona Cove will be shown and imitated and parodied for the next 70 years. But here is what the camera does not know. Here is what nobody watching that movie in a theater in 1953, or on television in 1973, or on a phone screen today will ever be able to see. At home, in a large house in Bel Air, California, Burt Lancaster's marriage is already on the real strain. Later family testimony and the major biographies describe his wife Norma's drinking as a problem that was becoming harder to ignore, while Burt's own long pattern of infidelity was already putting pressure on the marriage from the other direction. His mother, the woman who shaped his entire childhood, has been dead for more than 20 years, and he would speak for the rest of his life about how deeply that loss marked him. And the man standing in the surf, about to give the world one of the most romantic images of the 20th century, has a private life the camera cannot show. Now I want to be honest with you from the very first minute, because we are going to spend a good long while together, and I want you to trust me. There is a story that has been told for many years about the filming of that scene at Halona Cove. The story says that just before the kiss was filmed, Burt Lancaster received a note from home, a piece of paper that supposedly changed his mood and stayed with him for the rest of his life. I have looked for that note. I have looked in the biographies and in the interviews his children gave after his death, and in the memoirs of the people who worked on that film. And I have to tell you, plainly, there is no solid documentary proof that any specific note was handed to him on that beach. It is one of those Hollywood stories that gets told and retold, so I am not going to sell it to you as fact. But what the biographies and later family accounts do support is this. In the spring of 1953, Burt Lancaster's marriage was already under strain. Norma's drinking had become a real problem. Burt himself was not a faithful husband, and the pattern of affairs that would shadow the marriage was already part of their life together. That is more complicated than a mysterious note and less tidy. It is also much closer to what the record actually gives us. So when you see that famous kiss, and you have seen it, whether you remember it or not, try to hold this in your mind. One of the most romantic embraces in Hollywood history was performed by a man whose real home life, away from the camera, was already carrying tensions that would follow him for years. That is the man we are going to spend the next while with. Not the poster, not the smile. The man behind the smile. The son of a postal clerk. The kid from East Harlem who taught himself to swing on a trapeze bar. The circus acrobat who almost never became a movie star at all. The actor who refused to be owned by the studios. The public figure who stood beside civil rights campaigners and later lent his voice to the fight against AIDS. The husband who married 3 times. The father who, by his own children's honest testimony, was not always an easy man to live with. And the old man who, after a stroke in the final years of his life, was left largely unable to speak. By the end of our time together, you're going to know Burt Lancaster in a way that most people, even most of his fans, never did. Some of it is beautiful, some of it is hard. All of it, so far as I can honestly tell you, is what the record actually supports. So let us go back, all the way back, to the beginning. Burton Stephen Lancaster was born on the 2nd of November 1913 in a small apartment on East 106th Street in East Harlem in the city of New York. His father, James Henry Lancaster, worked for the United States Postal Service, a steady, respectable, poorly paid job that put food on the table and not much else. His mother, Elizabeth Roberts Lancaster, was, by every account we have, the moral center of that household. She was, according to Burt himself in interviews he gave many years later, the person who taught him what he was not, and what he was not allowed to become. East Harlem, in 1913, was not the East Harlem of today. It was a working-class neighborhood, densely packed, mostly poor, mostly immigrant. There were Irish families, and Italian families, and Jewish families, and by the time Burt was a teenager, growing numbers of black families and Puerto Rican families. On the block where the Lancasters lived, 4 different languages could sometimes be heard on the same stoop on the same afternoon. The Lancasters themselves were of Irish and English descent, and they were Protestants in a neighborhood that was mostly Catholic, which, in that time and place, was itself a small kind of difference. Burt was one of 5 children. The family was close, and it was disciplined, and it was not rich. And by every account, including his own, the person who mattered most in that apartment was his mother. Elizabeth Lancaster was, in the memory of every one of her children, a strong-willed, plain-spoken woman with a very clear sense of right and wrong. She insisted that her children read. She insisted that they behave. She insisted, above all, that they never take the easy path when a harder and better path was available. Burt would remember all his life the sort of things she used to say to him. And I'm going to give this to you as a reconstruction, not as her exact words, because we do not have a recording of Elizabeth Lancaster. But the sentiment that Burt himself described in interviews was essentially this. She would look at him and she would tell him in so many words, "Do not come back to me ordinary. Do not settle for mediocre." That was, in his own telling, the drumbeat of his childhood. She did not live to see him become a movie star. Elizabeth Lancaster died in 1929 of a cerebral hemorrhage before Burt had finished high school. He was 16 years old. He would speak in later life about the enormous force his mother had exerted on him, about the standards she had set, and about the sense that he had spent much of his life trying to live up to them. Now, the neighborhood itself gave him something else. It gave him the streets. And on the streets of East Harlem in the 1920s, a tall, athletic, physically fearless boy could find all kinds of trouble and all kinds of freedom. Burt was, from a very young age, unusually athletic. He was strong. He was coordinated. He climbed everything he could climb: fire escapes, lampposts, the beams inside the local settlement house. And it was at that settlement house, called the Union Settlement, on East 104th Street, that a small miracle happened. Somebody hung a horizontal bar in the gymnasium, and Burt, at the age of about 9 or 10, discovered that when he grabbed that bar and swung himself up onto it, he could do things that most other children simply could not do. He also met, right around that same time, a boy who would become the most enduring friend of his entire life. The boy's name was Nicholas Kuchar, but everybody called him Nick Cravat. Nick was small where Burt was tall. Nick was dark where Burt was fair. Nick was quick where Burt was strong. And from the middle of the 1920s onwards, wherever you saw one of them, you were very likely to see the other. They practiced together. They taught themselves acrobatics, first on the settlement house bar, and then, as they got older, on trapeze rigs at local gyms. By the time Burt was in his mid-teens, the two of them were serious. They were not just kids fooling around. They were preparing, without quite saying it out loud, to make their living with their bodies. Now, here is where I have to slow down and tell you something else about the young Burt Lancaster, because it matters, and it will matter again later on. He was not just an athlete. He was also, from a very early age, a reader. A serious reader. Books in that apartment on East 106th Street were treated the way food was treated. They were necessary. His mother had made sure of that. Burt would go, several times a week, to the local branch of the New York Public Library. He would carry home 4, 5, 6 books at a time. He read history. He read biography. He read novels. he read opera librettos. He read over and over the plays of Shakespeare. He would say many years later that if his life had gone differently, if the depression had not come, if his mother had lived, if any one of a dozen small doors had opened or closed a different way, he might well have become a schoolteacher, or a librarian, or a professor of literature at some quiet college somewhere. He was, in other words, a strange combination from the very beginning, a boxer's body and a scholar's mind. A kid who could do a backflip off a fire escape at 3 in the afternoon and quote you Julius Caesar at 4. He graduated from DeWitt Clinton High School in 1930. His mother had died the previous year, and in the autumn of 1930, Burt Lancaster enrolled on an athletic scholarship at New York University. He was going to study physical education. He was going to become, he thought, a coach or a teacher of gymnastics. He lasted 2 years. The reason he lasted only 2 years was partly the Great Depression. His family did not have money. The scholarship did not cover everything. And there was, for a young man with a body like his, another road opening up. A road that was, honestly, more exciting to him than any classroom. In the early 1930s, still not yet 20 years old, Burt Lancaster left New York University, and he and Nick Cravat became, formally and officially, a professional acrobatic act. They called themselves Lang and Cravat. They joined traveling circuses and vaudeville bills, and for most of the rest of the decade, the better part of 7 years, Burt Lancaster made his living not as an actor, not as a scholar, but as a man who hung upside down from a bar, 30 and 40 feet in the air, above crowds of paying strangers in tents and theaters across America. Think about that for a moment, because it is not a small thing. The face that would one day sell millions upon millions of movie tickets spent the better part of a decade being seen mostly from below, in the flicker of circus lights, by families in small American towns who had paid a few coins to sit on a wooden bench and watch him fly. He worked with the K Brothers Circus. He worked with Federal Theater Project circus units during the New Deal. He worked with a whole string of small outfits whose names are now mostly forgotten. He and Nick perfected an act built on bars, balance, acrobatics, and the kind of trust that only comes from years of knowing exactly how the other man's body will move. If Nick moved wrong, Burt fell. If Burt mistimed a catch, both of them could be hurt. It was that simple. And in 1939, after years on the road, a hand injury became serious enough that Burt could no longer count on acrobatics as a profession. The career that had carried him through most of his 20s was, essentially, finished. He was 26 years old. He had no college degree. He had a wife by then, his first wife, the fellow circus performer named June Ernst, whom he had married quietly in the mid-1930s and whom we will come back to in a moment, because her story is one of the loose threads in the Lancaster biography that most people do not know about. He had no money. He had no plan. And the world in 1939 was 3 months away from the start of the Second World War. For the next several years, he drifted through whatever work he could find. He worked as a salesman in a Chicago department store. He worked for a while as a singing waiter. He worked around refrigeration equipment and took other temporary jobs. He was not, in any obvious sense, a man on his way to becoming one of the most famous faces on earth. He was, in every practical sense, a former circus acrobat with a bad hand and a shrinking bank account, trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. And then, as the United States moved deeper into the Second World War, the Army solved the question of what came next for him. In early 1943, Burt Lancaster entered the United States Army. He was 29 years old. And what happened to him in uniform over the next several years would change absolutely everything. Because the Army, in its infinite and sometimes accidental wisdom, took a former circus acrobat from East Harlem, a man with a strong back, a good voice, a quick mind, and years of experience performing in front of large crowds of ordinary people, and it assigned him, of all things, to the entertainment corps. and it sent him, of all places, to Italy. The war took him to North Africa and Italy with an army entertainment unit. It also brought him into contact with a USO performer named Norma Anderson, a woman who would become central to the next 2 decades of his private life. But the chance encounter that opened the door to acting did not happen in a bombed-out corridor in Italy, as the legend is sometimes retold. It happened after he came home, in New York. On a discharge furlough, Lancaster went to visit Norma at the office where she was working. He stepped into an elevator. Another man stepped in with him. And by the time Burt Lancaster got off that elevator, the rest of his life was waiting a few floors away. The stranger in that elevator had been staring at him. Lancaster noticed it. He was a big, striking man, newly out of uniform, and he was used to being looked at. But this was different. When Burt got off at Norma's floor, the stranger got off too. For a moment, Lancaster later remembered, he wondered what the man wanted. Then the stranger produced a business card. He identified himself as an associate of the Broadway producer Irving Jacobs. Jacobs was preparing a new play about American soldiers in Italy called A Sound of Hunting, and the man thought Lancaster might be right for the part of a tough sergeant. Would he come in and read? Burt Lancaster had never had a formal acting lesson. He had never played a professional dramatic role. His experience as a performer came from circus rings, army entertainment shows, and the practical education of standing in front of strangers and learning how to hold their attention. But he had come home from war with no clear profession waiting for him. So when a completely unexpected invitation appeared in an elevator in New York, he said yes. That version of the story is less cinematic than a producer finding him in the ruins of wartime Italy. There is no shattered hallway, no perfectly timed question in the final weeks of the war. But the better documented version is, in its own way, even stranger. Lancaster had gone to see the woman he would soon marry. A man happened to share an elevator with him. The man happened to be connected to a play that needed exactly the kind of physical presence Lancaster possessed. And that coincidence opened the first door. What happens next is where things start to move very fast. Burt Lancaster was back in New York in the autumn of 1945. He was 32 years old. He had never acted professionally in his life. And within a matter of weeks, not months, weeks, he was cast in A Sound of Hunting, written by Harry Brown. The play is about American soldiers in Italy during the war. Burt Lancaster plays a tough, decent, physically imposing infantryman named Sergeant Mooney. He walks onto that Broadway stage on the 20th of November, 1945, and he does the only thing he really knows how to do. He stands there. He speaks the lines. He does not have years of technique to hide behind. He has presence, instinct, a voice, a body, and the ability to make people look at him. The play runs for 23 performances. 23. That is, by any measure, a Broadway flop. But it lasts long enough for reviewers, agents, and film scouts to notice the tall newcomer playing the sergeant. One of the men who came backstage was Harold Hecht, a small, sharp, ambitious former dancer with big plans of his own, and Hecht walked away convinced that Lancaster had the kind of presence Hollywood could use. Harold Hecht went backstage. He introduced himself. And within days, Burt Lancaster had signed a management contract with him. This is one of those moments in a life where, if you slow the tape down, you can see the whole rest of the story taking shape. Because Harold Hecht was not just an agent. Harold Hecht wanted, more than anything, to be a producer. He wanted his own company. He wanted to make his own films. And he had, in Burt Lancaster, exactly the kind of tall, handsome, physically extraordinary leading man he needed to convince Hollywood to give him a chance. The two of them made a deal at a coffee shop in New York in the winter of 1945 or early 1946. The exact date is a little fuzzy in the different tellings, but the substance is not. The deal was, essentially, this. Burt would go to Hollywood. He would take whatever acting jobs came along. But every dollar he could bank and every ounce of leverage he could build would go towards starting their own independent production company. They would not be studio slaves. They would own their own work. In 1945 and 1946, that was a radical idea. Almost every major star in Hollywood was, in that era, under long-term contract to one of the big studios: Warner Brothers, MGM, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, RKO, Universal, Columbia. The studios owned the actors' schedules, the actors' images, and in a lot of practical ways, the actors' lives. A star did not choose his own scripts. A star did not choose his own directors. A star did what he was told, and he was paid a salary. And if he complained too loudly, he was suspended without pay until he learned to behave. Burt Lancaster and Harold Hecht were going to try to break that model. Two men who, between them, had never made a Hollywood movie in their lives. But before any of that could happen, Burt had to actually become a movie star. And in the spring of 1946, he was flown out to Los Angeles for a screen test. The producer who ran that screen test was a man named Hal Wallis, a serious, methodical, very powerful independent producer with a deal at Paramount. Hal Wallis watched the screen test. Hal Wallis signed Burt Lancaster, on the spot, to a non-exclusive contract. Non-exclusive is the key word there. Wallis got first call on Burt's services. But Burt was free to make other pictures for other producers in between. It was, for 1946, an unusually flexible arrangement. And it was exactly the wedge that Harold Hecht had been looking for. Burt Lancaster's first film was called The Killers. It was released in August of 1946. It was based, very loosely, on a short story by Ernest Hemingway. It was directed by Robert Siodmak. It co-starred a young actress named Ava Gardner, who was, at that point, on her own way up. And Burt Lancaster played a doomed ex-boxer named Ole Anderson, nicknamed The Swede, a man who lies on a bed in a rented room in a small town and calmly waits for two hired killers to come and shoot him. Think about that for a second. This is a man's first movie. His very first movie. And he spends the opening scene lying on a bed, hardly moving, saying almost nothing, waiting to be murdered. It is one of the most difficult things you can ask a young actor to do. You cannot rely on charm. You cannot rely on physicality. You cannot rely on any of the tricks. You just have to be there, on that bed, and let the camera find whatever is inside you. And what the camera found, in the summer of 1946, was something the American movie audience had not quite seen before. Burt Lancaster on screen was big, physically big, but he was also very still. He had a way of holding himself, a way of looking at another person, a way of using silence that felt, to people watching in theaters, like something real. Not like an actor being tough, like a man being tough. The Killers was a hit. Not a giant hit, but a real, solid, respected hit. Critics wrote about the new man on the bed. Studios started calling. Producers started calling. And Burt Lancaster, at 32 years old, having just walked out of a Broadway flop less than a year before, was now, officially, a movie star. In the middle of all of this, in the last week of December of 1946, Burt Lancaster got married. This was his second marriage. His first, to the circus performer June Ernst, had been brief in everything except the paperwork. The relationship had ended long before Lancaster became famous, and he spoke about it very little in public. His second wife was Norma Anderson, the USO performer he had met during the war. She was blonde, attractive, funny, warm, and strong-willed. They were married on the 28th of December 1946. He was 33, she was 29. Together they would raise 5 children, James, Bill, Susan, Joanna, and Sigle, and build a marriage that, from the outside, could look for a very long time like the polished domestic life expected of a Hollywood star. On the inside, of course, it was not. But we will get there. For now, in 1947 and 1948, Burt Lancaster is riding a wave. He makes film after film. Brute Force, Desert Fury, I Walk Alone, Sorry, Wrong Number, Kiss the Blood of My Hands. He is working in a lot of these pictures with directors he respects, and in some of them with directors he cannot stand, and he is learning, on the job, in front of the camera, how to actually act. He is also in these early years developing a reputation, and this is where I have to be careful again, because the reputation is real, but the stories around it have been exaggerated over the years. The reputation, in a phrase, was this: Burt Lancaster was difficult. He was difficult with directors. He was difficult with producers. He was difficult with studio executives. He argued. He questioned. He rewrote lines. He rewrote scenes. He would, occasionally, physically pick up a director by the lapels and move him out of the way. That is not a metaphor. There are multiple documented incidents. In his biographer Kate Buford's meticulous book on his life, where crew members describe exactly that. He had, from the earliest days of his career, an absolute conviction that he knew what was best for the film, whether or not anyone else agreed. And he was, temperamentally, a man with a very short fuse. There are also stories from this early period about bar fights, about physical confrontations, about the young Burt Lancaster getting into scraps around Hollywood the way he had, as a teenager, gotten into scraps around East Harlem. Some of those stories are well documented. Some of them are, honestly, Hollywood gossip that got repeated so many times it hardened into legend. I am not going to pretend to tell you which specific bar, on which specific night, saw which specific fight. What I can tell you, on solid biographical evidence, is that in his late 20s and early 30s, Burt Lancaster was a physically formidable man, with a temper he had not yet learned to control, and that he occasionally used his fists. He was also, and this is important, starting to think, very seriously, about the world outside of himself. Because in 1947, the United States House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee, usually just called HUAC, began its famous investigation into supposed communist influence in the Hollywood motion picture industry. This is the beginning of what would become the Hollywood blacklist. Screenwriters were subpoenaed. Directors were subpoenaed. Actors were called to testify about their political beliefs and about the political beliefs of their friends. Careers were destroyed. Lives were destroyed. Some people, under enormous pressure, named other people. Some people refused to name anyone and paid an extraordinary price. Burt Lancaster, at this point, is not one of the most politically active men in Hollywood, but he is watching. And what he is watching is making him angry. Because Burt Lancaster, remember, is the son of Elizabeth Roberts Lancaster, the woman who told him not to come back ordinary. And Burt Lancaster, remember, is a lifelong reader of history, a man who has actually studied, in his spare time, the story of what governments do to their citizens when governments become afraid. In October of 1947, a group of prominent Hollywood figures formed something called the Committee for the First Amendment. Their stated purpose was to defend the constitutional rights of the men who had been subpoenaed by HUAC. The membership included Humphrey Bogart, it included Lauren Bacall, it included John Huston, Danny Kaye, Gene Kelly, Judy Garland, Frank Sinatra, and dozens of others. And it included, right there on the list, Burt Lancaster. Now, this is a moment I want you to hold on to, because it tells you something about the kind of man he was becoming. Burt Lancaster had been a movie star for, at that point, about 14 months. 14 months. He was not yet, in any sense, secure. He was still building his career. He did not yet own his own production company. He had a young wife, a baby, a mortgage. He had every reason in the world to keep his head down, do his job, cash his checks, and stay out of politics. And instead, he put his name on that list. He would, over the next 40 years, put his name on a lot of lists. He would march, he would speak, he would write checks. He would raise money for causes that were, in many cases, actively unpopular. And it started, essentially, right here, in the autumn of 1947, before he had really had time to lose his nerve. There is, in the FBI's own archives, these are files that were released to researchers under the Freedom of Information Act decades after the fact, there is a real, documented federal file on Burt Lancaster's political activities. It was maintained, on and off, for a very long time. It contains reports on his public statements, his associations, and the organizations he supported. I have seen it described in biographies and in academic articles. I want to be careful about how I describe it to you, because the internet is full of exaggerated claims about FBI files. What I can tell you honestly is that a bureau file on Burt Lancaster existed, that it was a substantial file by the standards of the time, and that it reflected the fact that the United States government, through several administrations, considered Burt Lancaster to be a person of political interest. Whether that means J. Edgar Hoover personally lay awake at night worrying about him, I would not put money on that. But the file was real. The surveillance, on some level, was real. And Burt Lancaster, for his part, did not particularly care. By the end of the 1940s, Burt and Harold Hecht had begun turning the plan they had discussed in New York into a real independent production operation. The company was known first as Norma Productions, named for Burt's wife. Later, as the partnership evolved, the Hecht-Lancaster name became increasingly prominent, and after James Hill joined them, the enterprise became Hecht-Hill-Lancaster. The names changed. The principle did not. A former circus acrobat and a former dancer, neither born into money and neither trained by the Hollywood establishment, were building a company designed to give them more control over the pictures they made. One of the early films made under the Norma Productions banner was Kiss the Blood Off My Hands, released in 1948. But the picture that most vividly announced what Lancaster's independence could look like was The Flame and the Arrow, released in 1950. It was a swashbuckler, a costume adventure. Burt played a medieval Italian archer named Dardo, a kind of Robin Hood figure, and the film was full of climbing, leaping, acrobatic sword fights, and the physical showmanship that had once kept him alive in the circus. And here was the beautiful thing. Burt was able to bring his oldest friend, Nick Cravat, onto the screen beside him, so that the partnership formed in East Harlem could become part of the Lancaster movie star image. Burt insisted on it. He wanted Nick with him. He wanted the audience to see what he could still do, what the two of them could still do together, with their own bodies, without doubles, without wires, without tricks. And when The Flame and the Arrow opened in the summer of 1950, audiences went, quite simply, out of their minds. Here was this tall, blonde, grinning man, swinging from ropes, leaping from balconies, doing handstands on the tips of siege towers, and doing it all himself, in front of the camera, with no cutting away. The film was an enormous hit. Norma Productions, still small by the standards of the major studios, suddenly looked less like an experiment and more like proof that Lancaster's insistence on independence could actually work. 2 years later, in 1952, they did it again with a film called The Crimson Pirate. More swashbuckling, more acrobatics, more Nick Cravat. Even bigger box office. And the industry started to notice something. It started to notice that this Burt Lancaster fellow, this loud, difficult, argumentative former circus acrobat, was not just a movie star. He was a movie star who was making his own movies. He was picking his own scripts. He was, in a quiet, steady, extremely stubborn way, doing something almost nobody in his position had done before. He was becoming the boss. And in the spring of 1953, a producer named Buddy Adler, over at Columbia Pictures, was struggling to cast the role of a tough, insubordinate, deeply human army sergeant named Milton Warden, in a film adaptation of a giant, controversial best-selling novel by a young writer named James Jones. The novel was called From Here to Eternity, and the man they were about to cast in that role was about to give the performance that would change everything. From Here to Eternity, the novel, was published in 1951. It was a huge book in every sense of the word, almost 900 pages. It won the National Book Award. It sold, over the course of the early 1950s, millions of copies. and it was, by the standards of its time, extraordinarily controversial. It portrayed the peacetime United States Army, in the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, as an institution full of casual cruelty, casual violence, casual racism, and casual sex. Officers cheated on their wives. Sergeants beat up soldiers in stockades. Enlisted men slept with prostitutes in downtown Honolulu. And the whole story ended, of course, with the Japanese planes coming out of the sky on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, and blowing that entire fragile world to pieces. Columbia Pictures had bought the film rights, and Columbia Pictures, in 1952 and 1953, was trying to figure out how to actually make this movie without getting itself destroyed by the production code, which was the industry's own internal censorship body, and by the United States Army, which had, understandably, some concerns about how it was going to be portrayed. The producer assigned to the picture was Buddy Adler. The director eventually attached was a man named Fred Zinnemann, a serious, quiet, meticulous Austrian-born filmmaker who had already made a name for himself with pictures like High Noon. And the casting process was, by all accounts, a nightmare. Every actor in Hollywood wanted a part in this film. Studios were pushing their contract stars, agents were pushing their clients. And through the middle of all of it, Buddy Adler and Fred Zinnemann were quietly agreeing on one thing. For the crucial role of First Sergeant Milton Warden, the tough, weary, morally complicated non-commissioned officer at the center of the story, they wanted Burt Lancaster. Burt read the script. He said yes. And by the spring of 1953, he was on his way to Hawaii. Now, I told you at the very beginning of this story about the kiss on the beach. I want to come back to that beach now, and I want to tell you what actually happened there and around it, as far as the historical record actually supports. Filming on From Here to Eternity began in Hawaii in March of 1953. The famous beach scene, Burt Lancaster and Deborah Kerr embracing in the surf while the Pacific washes over them, was shot at Halona Cove on the eastern coast of Oahu. It took several takes. The two actors were, by all accounts, physically uncomfortable. The water was cold in places, salty everywhere, and the sand got into absolutely everything. Deborah Kerr, a very proper, very disciplined English actress who had spent most of her career at MGM, playing genteel ladies in long dresses, was there in a bathing suit, being pinned to the sand by Burt Lancaster, over and over, while the camera rolled. What both of them said, in later interviews, was that the scene was much less romantic to shoot than it looks on screen. Kerr described getting mouthfuls of seawater. Lancaster described trying not to crush her. There was on set a lot of laughing between takes, and a lot of towels, and a lot of standing around waiting for the light to be right. That is the reality of the most romantic kiss in the history of American cinema. Two professional actors, cold and wet and salty, doing their job over and over until the director said, "That is the one." But here is the part of the story that is harder to see on film and harder to prove in a documentary sense. In the spring of 1953, while Burt Lancaster was in Hawaii shooting one of the great performances of his career, his marriage back in California was already under real strain. I told you earlier that his wife, Norma Anderson Lancaster, was already by this point drinking heavily. That much is not gossip. That is stated on the record by his own children in interviews they gave many years later, and it is confirmed in the standard biographies of his life. Norma's drinking would get worse, not better, over the years. Their marriage would last, officially, until 1969, more than 2 decades in total. But the people who knew them both would say, later on, that on the inside it had been troubled for a very long time. Burt himself, in this period, was not a faithful husband. I am not going to attach a specific affair to a specific day on the Hawaii shoot unless the evidence supports it. What the biographies and later family testimony do support is the larger pattern. Lancaster had numerous relationships outside his marriage over the years, and his private life was considerably less orderly than the public image of the Lancaster family suggested. Hollywood in the 1950s often protected the private lives of major stars. But protection from publicity is not the same thing as domestic peace. So when you picture Burt Lancaster at Halona Cove in the spring of 1953, do not picture the simple fantasy of a movie star whose real life matched the romance on the screen. Picture a man who had already learned how thoroughly a public performance could be separated from a private life. On the beach, he is Sergeant Warden, kissing Deborah Kerr while the surf rolls over them. Away from the camera, he is a husband in a troubled marriage, her father whose work keeps pulling him away from home, and still, in some deep part of his memory, the boy from East Harlem whose mother died when he was 16. Those things do not explain the performance, but they belong to the life of the man giving it. From Here to Eternity was released on the 5th of August 1953. It was an immediate, gigantic hit and became one of the biggest commercial successes of the year. More important for the people who made it, the picture was no longer merely a controversial adaptation that Columbia had somehow managed to get through production. It had become a national event. And in March of 1954, at the 26th Academy Awards ceremony, the film won 8 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director for Fred Zinnemann, Best Supporting Actor for Frank Sinatra, and Best Supporting Actress for Donna Reed. Burt Lancaster was nominated for Best Actor. He did not win. The award that year went to William Holden for Stalag 17. Burt sat in the audience, in a tuxedo, in the Pantages Theater in Hollywood, and he applauded, and he smiled, and he lost. He would tell interviewers in later years that he had been genuinely disappointed. He had wanted that Oscar. He would not win Best Actor for another 7 years, but something else had happened. Something bigger than any single award. Burt Lancaster, in the summer of 1953, had crossed a line that most movie stars never cross. He had gone from being a bankable leading man, of which Hollywood at any given time has maybe 24, to being an actor, capital A, not just a star, an artist. Somebody the critics wrote about seriously. Somebody the serious European directors began, quietly, to want to work with. And once you are on that side of the line, in Hollywood, the game changes forever. You can start choosing. And over the next 8 years, Burt Lancaster chose and chose and chose again. And he assembled one of the most extraordinary runs of work by any American actor in the entire 1950s. 1954, Vera Cruz, opposite Gary Cooper. 1955, The Kentuckian, which he also directed himself. 1955, The Rose Tattoo, opposite Anna Magnani, who would win the Best Actress Oscar for it. That same period also brought Marty, the small independent drama made through the Hecht-Lancaster operation that won the Academy Award for Best Motion Picture. The Oscar itself went to producer Harold Hecht, but the victory was a powerful demonstration that Lancaster's company could compete at the highest level without behaving like a conventional studio. 1956, Trapeze, in which he finally, at the age of 42, went back up onto a real circus trapeze rig in front of a real camera and returned to the physical world in which he had spent so much of his youth. 1957, Gunfight at the OK Corral, opposite Kirk Douglas, playing Wyatt Earp. And Kirk Douglas, let me stop here for a moment, because you cannot really tell the story of Burt Lancaster without telling, at least a little, the story of Kirk Douglas. They were, at first glance, very similar men. Both were born in 1916 or thereabouts. Well, Burt in 1913, Kirk in 1916, but close enough. Both had come out of hard, poor, immigrant American childhoods. Both were physically striking, both were fiercely intelligent. Both were absolutely determined to control their own careers. And both were temperamentally difficult, argumentative, opinionated men who were not particularly good at losing an argument. They started making pictures together in the late 1940s, and they would make 7 films together over the course of their careers. And their friendship, which lasted in some form or other from the late 1940s until Burt Lancaster's death in 1994, was one of the great Hollywood friendships of the 20th century. It was also, according to Kirk himself in his own memoirs, a friendship that included fights. Real fights. Not physical, but loud, angry, prolonged arguments on set and off. They needled each other. They competed with each other. They were, Kerr would later write, brothers in some deep and impossible way. And they were also, sometimes, very hard on each other. 1957 was also the year of one of Burt Lancaster's very greatest performances, in one of the strangest, meanest, most bitterly beautiful films Hollywood has ever produced. The film was called Sweet Smell of Success. It was directed by Alexander McKendrick. It was written, primarily, by Clifford Odets and Ernest Lehman. And Burt Lancaster played a man named J.J. Hunsaker, a monstrously powerful New York gossip columnist based, quite openly, on the real-life columnist Walter Winchell. If you have never seen Sweet Smell of Success, and you want to understand what Burt Lancaster could do as an actor when he was really, seriously unleashed, then that is the film to watch. He plays Hunsaker with rimless glasses, a soft voice, and a stillness that is, honestly, terrifying. Hunsaker never raises his voice. Hunsaker never throws a punch. Hunsaker sits at his corner table at 21 in Manhattan, and he ruins people's lives with a sentence. And Burt Lancaster, the man who spent his youth flying through the air, plays this man of pure malice by hardly moving at all. It is one of the great performances of American cinema, and in 1957, most audiences and most Academy voters did not know what to make of it. The film was a commercial disappointment. Today it is considered a masterpiece. That happens sometimes. 1960, Elmer Gantry. This is where Burt Lancaster finally won the acting Oscar he had wanted since 1953. Elmer Gantry was based on the Sinclair Lewis novel of the same name, published in 1927, about a charming, drunken, morally bankrupt traveling salesman who reinvents himself as a fire-breathing Christian revivalist preacher in the American Midwest of the 1920s. It is a story about religious hypocrisy, about American showmanship, about the enormous, dangerous power of a man who can stand in front of a crowd and make them believe. And Burt Lancaster, who by 1960 was 46 years old, played that man, Elmer Gantry, the preacher, with everything he had. The grin, the sweat, the physicality, the bellowing sermons, the quiet, terrible private moments when the mask slips and you see, underneath, that Gantry does not actually believe a word of what he is saying, and that some part of him hates himself for it. It was, in a way, the perfect role for a former circus acrobat turned intellectual turned movie star. Because Elmer Gantry is, in the end, a performer standing on a stage, working a crowd, doing the tricks that get the crowd to open its wallet and its heart. Burt Lancaster knew, all the way down in his bones, exactly what that felt like. Elmer Gantry premiered on the 7th of July, 1960. Burt Lancaster won the Academy Award for Best Actor at the ceremony held on the 17th of April, 1961. He was 47 years old. It had taken him 15 years from that first extraordinary turn from Broadway novice to film star to win Hollywood's highest acting prize. And the important word there is acting. His production company had already helped put Marty into the winner's circle as Best Motion Picture. Elmer Gantry was the moment the Academy honored Lancaster himself for what he did in front of the camera. And now, standing on top of that mountain in the early 1960s, he was going to do something almost nobody in his position ever really does. He was going to keep taking risks. Because in the first half of the 1960s, Burt Lancaster, having reached by any reasonable measure the top of the Hollywood profession, deliberately started making films that were harder, weirder, more European, more political, and more likely to lose money. In 1961, he played the German judge Ernst Janning in Stanley Kramer's Judgment at Nuremberg. A serious, grave, deeply thought-out performance in a film about the Nazi war crimes trials of the late 1940s. In 1962, he played Robert Franklin Stroud in Birdman of Alcatraz, a film about the real-life American convict who spent decades in solitary confinement and became a self-taught ornithologist. I should mention, in fairness, that the film's portrait of the real Robert Stroud was considerably kinder than the historical evidence supports. Stroud in life was, by most accounts, a much more violent and disturbing figure than the gentle scholar Burt plays on screen. But as a performance, Birdman of Alcatraz is a small, quiet, meticulously observed piece of work. And in 1963, Burt Lancaster did something almost no other Hollywood leading man of his generation would have done. He went to Italy at the age of 49 and starred in Luchino Visconti's The Leopard. It was an Italian production, and Lancaster worked in a multilingual filmmaking environment. In the Italian release, his voice was dubbed. What mattered was not the language on the soundtrack. What mattered was that one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars had submitted himself to the discipline and scale of a director whose methods were rooted in a very different cinematic tradition. The Leopard, based on the great novel by Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa, is the story of an aging Sicilian nobleman named Don Fabrizio, Prince of Salina, in the 1860s, watching his world and his class and his entire way of life slowly disappear as modern Italy is born. It is an enormous, slow, gorgeous, elegiac film. It is more than 3 hours long. Visconti wanted a European actor for the role originally. He had wanted, at various points, the Russian actor Nikolai Cherkasov. And then the Soviet-era wish list changed, and there were negotiations, and eventually, mostly for financial reasons, an American star was attached to the project to help sell it internationally. That American star was Burt Lancaster. Visconti, at first, was not happy about it. He had wanted somebody else. He and Burt did not, in the early weeks of production, get along. There are stories, retold in multiple biographies of both men, of Burt working extremely hard to win over a director who initially had very little use for him. He studied, he listened, he watched, he read the novel, in translation, again and again. And slowly, over the course of the shoot, in the heat of Sicily in the summer of 1962, something happened between the two men. Visconti began to see in Burt Lancaster something he had not expected to see. And Burt Lancaster began to see in Luchino Visconti one of the most important artistic influences of his entire life. The Leopard opened at the Cannes Film Festival in the spring of 1963. It won the Palme d'Or. And Burt Lancaster, who had been in movies for exactly 17 years and who could just as easily have been coasting on his fame at that point, had instead, at 49, delivered one of the great performances of European cinema. But while all of this was happening, the Oscar, the European films, the awards, the international acclaim, the private life of Burt Lancaster was quietly, steadily, painfully unraveling. And it is to that private life and to some of the friendships that would define the rest of his story that we need to turn next. The Leopard had shown what Lancaster could do when he submitted himself to a director from a completely different tradition. But 1963 also revealed something else about him, something that had nothing to do with acting technique. There is another piece of the 1960s that belongs here, because it tells you what Lancaster was becoming outside his own house and outside the studio gates. On the 28th of August, 1963, he took part in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And he was not merely a celebrity face somewhere in the crowd. Historical recordings show him speaking from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. He had brought with him a scroll from Americans in Paris expressing solidarity with the march, and he spoke about the difficulty of defending America's ideals abroad while racial injustice remained unresolved at home. On the same day that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the "I Have a Dream" speech, Burt Lancaster used his own public voice, however briefly, as part of that larger gathering. By the middle of the 1960s, Burt Lancaster's home life, on paper, still looked exactly the way an American movie star's home life was supposed to look. There was the big house in Bel Air. There was the wife of nearly 20 years. There were the 5 children, Bill, James, Susan, Joanna, and Sigle, growing up in that house, going to school, riding horses, doing homework, having birthday parties. There were photographs, when photographers were invited, of a handsome family posed against a beautiful California garden. And behind all of that, according to the people who actually lived inside that house, there was something else going on entirely. I am not going to sit in judgment of a marriage that ended more than half a century ago, and both people at the center of it are long dead. What matters here is what the record supports, and what members of the Lancaster family themselves later said about the home in which they grew up. Norma Anderson Lancaster, Burt's second wife, the mother of his 5 children, was by the middle of the 1960s an alcoholic. That is a plain, factual word, and it is the word the family themselves eventually used. Her drinking, which had already been a problem in the early 1950s, had gotten steadily worse over the years. Burt tried, at various points, to get her help. There were periods of sobriety. There were relapses. There were the kinds of scenes that happen in a house where one adult drinks too much and the other adult is, most of the year, away on location. And Burt, for his part, was away on location more or less constantly. He was making 1, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 films a year in this period. He was also, as we already discussed, repeatedly unfaithful. Later accounts of the marriage do not describe a single dramatic betrayal that broke everything at once. They describe a pattern. Work pulled him away. Affairs damaged trust. Norma's drinking worsened. Burt could be warm, generous, brilliant company, and he could also be controlling, quick-tempered, and emotionally difficult. A family can contain all of those truths at the same time. His son Bill Lancaster, who would grow up to become a screenwriter, most famous for writing the 1976 film The Bad News Bears, and later the 1982 John Carpenter film The Thing, spoke publicly about his father in ways that were affectionate but not uncritical. Bill contracted polio when he was very young, and he lived with its physical effects for the rest of his life. He would die from cardiac arrest in 1997, only a few years after his father. And the portrait that emerges from the family's recollections is of a father capable of enormous warmth and enormous distance, sometimes within the same relationship. The Lancaster daughters, in the interviews they gave, described a similar kind of father. Loving. Present when he was present. Enormously physically affectionate when he was in a good mood. And also, at times, moody, difficult, unpredictable, quick-tempered. A man who could dominate a room without meaning to. A man whose approval, when it came, felt like sunlight, and whose disapproval, when it came, felt like a door closing. They would also say, and this matters, that he was a father who read to them, who took them to the theater, who talked to them seriously from the time they were small children about books, about music, about opera, about ideas. Whatever else he was not a father who ignored his children's minds. The marriage to Norma ended formally in 1969, after more than 2 decades. By then, the separation had been developing for years. The divorce was not turned into a grand public spectacle, but later family accounts make clear that it was painful and overdue. Norma would live for almost 2 more decades after the marriage ended. She died in 1988. I am telling you all of this now, in one place, because I do not want to keep coming back to it. It is part of the story. It is a real part of who he was, but it is not the whole story. And what happens in the second half of Burt Lancaster's life, his 60s and his 70s, is, in many ways, more interesting than what happened in the first half. Because the second half of Burt Lancaster's life would not simply repeat the first. The roles changed, his body changed, his politics became more visible, his family changed around him, and the kind of courage required of him changed as well. Then came the mid-1960s, and the roles became darker. In 7 Days in May, released in 1964, Lancaster played General James Mattoon Scott, a charismatic military leader involved in a plot to remove the elected president of the United States. It was exactly the kind of part Lancaster liked by then. Physically authoritative, politically charged, and morally unsettling. In The Train, made in the same period, he played a French railway official caught in the struggle to prevent looted art from being carried out of France during the final days of the German occupation. The film was muscular, intelligent, and almost brutally physical. And Lancaster, already past 50, still insisted on doing far more with his own body than most stars of his generation would have attempted. The Professionals followed in the middle of the decade, another picture that used the old Lancaster physicality but placed it inside a more cynical world. And then came The Swimmer, released in 1968. If you want one film that shows how far he had traveled from The Flame and the Arrow, watch that one. Lancaster spends much of the picture in swimming trunks, moving through the pools of affluent suburban neighbors as if he can simply swim his way home. At first the body looks like the old Burt Lancaster body, powerful, bronzed, almost absurdly alive. Then, pool by pool, conversation by conversation, the confidence begins to collapse. The film turns the movie star's famous physical presence against him. The body remains visible, while the life behind it is revealed as damaged, lonely, and full of denial. It was not a great commercial triumph when it appeared. It became, over time, one of the performances most often cited by people who wanted to prove that Lancaster had always been more than muscles and teeth. In 1974, he starred in a film called Conversation Piece, directed once again by Luchino Visconti. Visconti, by this point, was in poor health. He had suffered a stroke in 1972. He would live only until 1976. And the film was a small, chamber-piece drama about an aging, retired professor in a Rome apartment, living quietly among his books and his paintings, whose life is turned upside down by the arrival of a chaotic, glamorous, morally reckless family of tenants. Burt played the professor. It was, in a sense, the mirror image of Don Fabrizio in The Leopard. Another old man, at the end of a world he had loved, watching younger and messier people trample through his last quiet years. In 1976, Burt Lancaster went back to Italy one more time, to work with Bernardo Bertolucci on his enormous epic 1900 Novecento in Italian. He played in the opening section of the film an aging northern Italian landowner named Alfredo Berlinghieri, the patriarch of a family whose story would then unfold across the 20th century. It is a strange, dreamlike, physically beautiful performance. He is not the center of the entire film, but his early scenes establish a world of land, hierarchy, appetite, and decay. Bertolucci does something interesting with Lancaster's body. The physique that Hollywood had once photographed as a symbol of vitality is shown here as old, exposed, fallible, and mortal. Even a deliberately uncomfortable sexual scene is less about glamour than about the collapse of masculine certainty. For an actor who had spent decades being photographed as strength itself, the willingness to appear physically diminished was part of the point. In 1977, the film I want to point you to is a strange, science-fictional political thriller called Twilight's Last Gleaming, directed by Robert Aldrich. Burt played a rogue United States Air Force general who seizes a nuclear missile silo and threatens to launch missiles unless the American government tells the public a secret truth about the Vietnam War. It is not the most celebrated film in Lancaster's career. It is, however, a completely characteristic choice for the older Lancaster, a movie star well into his 60s, putting his authority behind a paranoid political thriller about power, secrecy, war, and the things governments decide the public is not allowed to know. And then, in 1980, at the age of 66, he did one of the very best things he had ever done. He starred in a small, quiet, aching, beautifully written film called Atlantic City, directed by the French director Louis Malle, written by John Guare. Burt played an aging, small-time gangster named Lou Pascal, living in a fading resort town on the Jersey Shore, dreaming of a criminal past he had never really had, tenderly caring for the bedridden widow of an old mob boss, and slowly, unexpectedly, becoming involved with a young woman played by Susan Sarandon. Atlantic City is, honestly, one of the great performances of American cinema. Burt Lancaster in that film is old, tired, physically diminished, and yet somehow completely, undeniably a leading man. He gives a performance built almost entirely on small gestures, on the way he lights a cigarette, on the way he adjusts his tie in a mirror. on the way he looks at Susan Sarandon and sees, in her, a whole life he never had. He was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor. He did not win. The award that year went to Henry Fonda for On Golden Pond, in a victory widely understood as a valedictory recognition of one of Hollywood's most beloved veteran actors. But Burt Lancaster's performance in Atlantic City is, quite possibly, the finest single piece of work he ever did. And he was 66 years old when he did it. The good roles did not simply stop there. In the early 1980s, he appeared in Local Hero as Felix Happer, an eccentric American oil executive who spends as much time looking at the stars as he does thinking about money. It was a supporting role, smaller than the parts on which his legend had been built, and Lancaster seemed completely comfortable with that. The old hunger to dominate every frame had eased. He could enter a film, alter its temperature, and leave. That too is a kind of mastery. His body, however, was beginning to collect the bill for a lifetime of strain. In 1983, after heart problems, Lancaster underwent major coronary bypass surgery. The man who had once sold himself to audiences as almost indestructible had now been opened up by surgeons and forced into recovery. He kept working. He reunited with Kirk Douglas for Tough Guys in the middle of the decade. He played an aging patriarch in Rocket Gibraltar. And in 1989, in Field of Dreams, he appeared as the older version of Archibald Moonlight Graham, a doctor who once had a fleeting chance at Major League Baseball and chose another life. The role was quiet, almost weightless, and deeply suited to the late Lancaster. Field of Dreams became his final feature film. His final television performance was in Separate but Equal, in which he played the lawyer John W. Davis opposite Sidney Poitier's Thurgood Marshall. It was filmed before Lancaster's stroke and broadcast in 1991, after illness had already closed the door on further acting. He also, in these years, was thinking a lot about the world, and I mean the world in the broadest sense. Because throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Burt Lancaster continued to be, without ever quite becoming a full-time activist, one of the most publicly political leading actors in Hollywood. He also supported campaigns against nuclear weapons. He supported the American Civil Liberties Union. He spoke against aspects of the Vietnam War and gave money to Democratic political candidates. He did not turn himself into a professional activist, and not every cause with which he was associated can be reduced to a single political label. But the pattern is clear. When something in public life offended his sense of fairness or freedom, Lancaster was often willing to attach his famous name to the argument. Those positions brought criticism. They also helped explain why federal agencies took an interest in his political associations. The same interest reflected in the FBI material that later became available to researchers. Lancaster knew that public political speech could complicate a star's life. He kept doing it anyway. And that public instinct, the willingness to put his name next to an unpopular or frightening subject, became especially visible in the middle of the 1980s. Let me tell you about Rock Hudson. In the 1950s and 1960s, Rock Hudson was, in his own right, one of the biggest movie stars in the world. He was tall, handsome, charming, warm on screen, and beloved by American audiences. He was also a gay man living in an industry where public disclosure of that fact could have destroyed a leading man's career. Lancaster and Hudson moved in overlapping Hollywood worlds and were described publicly as friends. What we do not have solid documentary evidence for is the more intimate claim that Lancaster was part of some tiny private circle to whom Hudson personally disclosed his sexuality years earlier. We do not need that claim to understand what happened between them in 1985. In the summer of 1985, Rock Hudson's illness became public, and then, with enormous worldwide attention, so did the fact that he had AIDS. He was one of the first internationally famous people whose diagnosis forced millions of people who had treated AIDS as something distant to confront the disease through the face of someone they already knew. AIDS in 1985 was surrounded by ignorance, fear, stigma, and cruelty. Many Americans did not understand how the virus was transmitted. People with AIDS could be treated not simply as patients, but as threats. Public health arguments were tangled with prejudice against gay men. Fear traveled faster than knowledge. And into the middle of that atmosphere, a real, documented, historically verified atmosphere of hysteria, walked Burt Lancaster. On the 19th of September, 1985, at the Commitment to Life benefit for AIDS Project Los Angeles, Burt Lancaster stood before a huge ballroom and read a statement attributed to Rock Hudson, who was too ill to attend. Lancaster had specifically asked to read it if Hudson sent a message. The evening raised an extraordinary amount of money and became one of the early landmark Hollywood AIDS benefits. Hudson died on the 2nd of October, 1985, 13 days later. Burt Lancaster did not treat that night as a one-time gesture. In the years that followed, he continued to lend his name, his presence, and his celebrity to AIDS organizations and education. In 1987, Aid for AIDS honored him, and he had posed for an educational poster urging people to think before they acted and not to get AIDS. None of that makes him the central figure in the history of AIDS activism. People living with the disease, gay activists, doctors, nurses, organizers, and families carried burdens far heavier than his. But for an aging mainstream Hollywood star of his generation, publicly standing there mattered. There is another issue that needs to be handled with the same care. Over the years, memoirs, biographies, and later commentary have made claims about Burt Lancaster's own sexuality, including claims that he had relationships with men as well as women. The evidence is not uniform, and Lancaster left no clear first-person statement defining himself in those terms. What is certain is that he married 3 women and had numerous documented relationships with women. What is also true is that some serious biographical accounts preserve testimony or allegations suggesting a more complicated private life. The responsible thing is not to turn uncertainty into certainty in either direction. So I am not going to label him on evidence that does not allow a clean conclusion. I am going to tell you what he did in public, because that part of the record is much firmer. And what he did in the last decade of his life was extraordinary. In September of 1990, Burt Lancaster married for the 3rd time. Contemporary reports identified his wife as Susan Shearer. Later biographical accounts also refer to her as Susan Martin. She had worked in television production and had been his companion for years. He was 76 years old. She was considerably younger. Contemporary accounts described a small, private wedding and a relationship that had already lasted for years before they made it legal. There had been other significant relationships between the end of his marriage to Norma and this late marriage. But Susan was the partner who would be beside him during the final, most physically difficult period of his life. Less than 3 months after that marriage, on the 30th of November 1990, Burt Lancaster suffered a stroke while visiting a friend in Los Alamitos. He was 77 years old. Doctors initially described the stroke as moderate, but its consequences were serious. There was weakness and partial paralysis on his right side, and there were major problems with speech. He began physical and speech therapy. In the years that followed, he recovered some things and remained mentally present, but the great booming instrument he had used throughout his career was never truly restored. He would live in that condition for another 3 years and 11 months. And it is those final years and the strange, quiet, painfully human way they ended that we need to talk about last. Try to imagine for a moment what those last 4 years must have been like for him. For 77 years, Burt Lancaster had been, above all things, a man who used his body and his voice. He had climbed, he had jumped, he had swung from ropes 40 feet above circus crowds. He had stood on Broadway stages. He had spoken lines in a great booming voice in front of movie cameras from Hollywood to Sicily to the sands of Halona Cove. He had argued with directors, hollered at producers, sung at parties, read aloud to his children in his own big house in Bel Air. He had, more or less every day of his adult life, used his voice as his primary tool for being alive in the world. And on the 30th of November, 1990, in a matter of minutes, that voice was changed forever. The stroke struck while Lancaster was visiting a friend in Los Alamitos in Orange County. Paramedics took him to Los Alamitos Medical Center. Doctors initially described the stroke as moderate, but the consequences were anything but trivial. His right side was weakened and partly paralyzed. Speech became difficult. He spent time in the hospital and then moved into extensive physical and speech therapy. Over the months that followed, there were signs of improvement, but the voice that had filled Broadway theaters, sound stages, political rallies, and family rooms never returned to what it had been. Later accounts describe him as largely unable to carry on the kind of full, easy conversation that had once been one of his defining powers. He never appeared in another film. He never gave another major interview. He lived largely in seclusion, and the public Burt Lancaster, the man who had once seemed to occupy every screen, every premiere, every photograph, became almost entirely private. That change may have been the most dramatic reversal of his life. The former acrobat, who had made a career out of movement, now needed help moving. The man who had argued with half of Hollywood now had to struggle for words. Susan cared for him through those final years, with medical help and therapy around him. His children remained part of his life. Friends followed his condition, although in the later period he increasingly limited visitors. Kirk Douglas, who had known him for more than 40 years, would later write about the terrible recognition of seeing a man famous for force and command reduced by illness. Kirk himself would suffer a devastating stroke a few years later, in 1996, and would spend years working to recover his speech. There is a small and painful symmetry in that. Two men who had spent decades arguing, acting, joking, and competing with each other, both eventually confronted the possibility of losing the instrument with which they had done so much of it. There are family and biographical recollections about those last years that go beyond the hospital record, and this is where a responsible biography has to distinguish memory from measurement. People close to Lancaster remembered a man who was still emotionally responsive, still interested in the world around him, still capable of recognition, humor, affection, frustration, and pleasure, even when language had become painfully difficult. Those memories are not medical charts. They are the way people who loved him remembered living beside the aftermath of the stroke. The essential point is that the loss of fluent speech did not mean the disappearance of the person. Music remained important to him. Reading remained important in the household. Family members and friends described ways of communicating that did not depend on long sentences, expressions, gestures, touch, recognition, the effort to form a word even when the word would not come. It is tempting, in a biography, to turn those moments into perfect scenes. The opera playing at exactly the right time, the hand being taken at exactly the right instant, the single syllable that carries everything. Real life is rarely that neat. What the recollections give us is something less cinematic and more human. A man whose physical and verbal range had been drastically reduced, but who had not simply vanished behind the damage. Some people who knew Lancaster also remembered him as gentler in those years than the famously explosive man of earlier decades. That may have reflected age, it may have reflected illness, it may have reflected the dependence forced on someone who had spent a lifetime insisting on independence. No outsider can know exactly how much was neurological change and how much was the slow rearrangement of personality that can come with age, vulnerability, and loss. But the contrast is hard to miss. The man who once seemed capable of overpowering every room had entered a period in which force was no longer available to him. And perhaps that is enough. We do not need to turn a stroke into a moral lesson. We do not need to pretend that illness purified him or solved the contradictions that had been there all along. It simply changed the conditions under which he lived. The difficult, generous, vain, political, physical, intellectual man was still there, but living inside a body that had imposed new limits. Burt Lancaster died on the 20th of October, 1994, at his home in Century City in Los Angeles. He was 80 years old. The cause of death was a heart attack. His wife Susan announced that he had died overnight. After nearly 4 years of declining health following the stroke, one of the most physically commanding stars in American film history died quietly at home. There was no funeral or memorial service. Lancaster had asked for none. There would be no big Hollywood ceremony, no cameras, no red carpet, no parade of celebrities delivering rehearsed eulogies for news crews outside. His body was cremated. His ashes were placed beneath a large oak tree at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, and a small ground plaque carrying his name and the years of his life marks the place. It is an unusually modest marker for a man whose face had once filled some of the largest screens in the world. That is where the son of Elizabeth Roberts Lancaster of East 106th Street in East Harlem is buried. Now, I want to close this the way I started it, if you will let me. Because we began, a long while ago now, on a beach in Hawaii in the spring of 1953 with a man in the surf about to create one of the most famous kisses in Hollywood history. And I told you at the start that by the time we were done, you were going to know him in a way that most people, even most of his fans, never really did. So let me tell you what I think, having spent this long time with him. I think Burt Lancaster was, in the plainest possible sense, one of the most improbable major American movie stars of the 20th century. Almost nothing about his life ought to have led him to that beach at Halona Cove. He was born poor in a walk-up apartment in Harlem. He lost his mother, the emotional foundation of his childhood, when he was 16 years old. He walked out of college. He spent the better part of the 1930s as a circus acrobat, hanging upside down for small pay in tents and theaters across America. He injured his hand and lost the profession on which he had depended. He drifted. He sold things. He worked as a singing waiter. He repaired refrigerators. He entered the army during a world war. And then, after he came home, on his way to visit Norma Anderson in a New York office building, a stranger noticed him in an elevator and invited him to read for a Broadway play. There was no ruined Italian corridor, no single theatrical lie that transformed him in 1 second. The real story was stranger in a quieter way. One chance encounter, one audition, one failed play, one agent with a plan, and then the doors began opening faster than anyone could have predicted. I think he was, as a man, complicated. Not in some polite Hollywood biographer way, but honestly complicated. He was, at various points in his life, a bad husband and a devoted father, a warm friend and a difficult colleague, a public idealist and a private hedonist, a physical force and an intellectual, a bully and a defender of bullied people. He could be frightening in an argument on a film set, and decades later he could stand before a ballroom and read the words of a dying friend at a moment when fear surrounding AIDS made even public association meaningful. All of that was the same man. Human beings are like that. Nobody worth knowing is only one thing. I think, in the end, that the most important thing about him is not the beach, and not the Oscar, and not the swashbucklers, and not the swagger. I think the most important thing about him is the arc, the distance he covered, the kind of boy he was on East 106th Street in 1920, and the kind of old man he was in that quiet house in Century City in 1994. Everything in between was, in a sense, the long process of one particular human being finding out what kind of man he could become, and then trying, sometimes well and sometimes badly, to actually become it. There is one last thing I want to leave you with, because I think it is honest, and I think it is beautiful, and I think it is very hard to say out loud in the world we live in today. Burt Lancaster was, for many decades, one of the most recognizable and relentlessly photographed stars of his era. His face and his smile and his body became part of the visual furniture of the 20th century. Millions of people who never met him and never would felt in some vague, distant way that they knew him. That is what movie stars are, in a certain sense. They are strangers whose public images become so familiar that audiences begin to mistake recognition for knowledge. And yet, if you actually sit down and try to write his life from the documents, What you find is how much of him remained outside the image. We knew the shape. We knew the outline. We knew the smile. We knew the beach. The records give us fragments of the rest. The East Harlem boy whose mother pushed him toward books and ambition. The young acrobat traveling through Depression-era America with Nick Cravat. The veteran who stepped into a New York elevator without an acting career and stepped out with an invitation to audition. The father who loved his children's minds but spent enormous stretches of their childhood away on location. The husband whose infidelities existed alongside a marriage damaged by alcoholism. The older actor who kept choosing difficult films when safer ones were available. The political celebrity who spoke at the March on Washington. The aging star who publicly joined the fight against AIDS. And finally, the man whose stroke narrowed the physical and verbal world in which he had always moved so confidently. Even with all of that, there are rooms in his life we cannot enter. There are thoughts we cannot document. A responsible biography has to leave those doors closed. We knew none of that. We just knew the kiss on the beach. That is the strange, sad, wonderful truth about famous people. And it is the strange, sad, wonderful truth about all people, really, including the ones we live with and love and think we understand. There's always more inside a person than what the surface shows. There's always a whole other life going on in there, made up of memories and regrets and small private moments that never make it into any photograph. Burt Lancaster's life, if it teaches us anything, teaches us to be careful with the surfaces of other people. To assume that behind every polished, confident public face there is, almost certainly, a whole tangled interior world of things that person is carrying and has never quite been able to put down. The movie star kissing the actress in the surf is also, always, the son missing his dead mother. The old man in the wheelchair, largely unable to speak, is also, always, still the boy who taught himself to fly on a bar in a settlement house gymnasium in East Harlem 100 years ago, on a summer afternoon nobody remembers. That is the man. That was the man. Burton Stephen Lancaster, born the 2nd of November 1913, died the 20th of October 1994. He was a lot of things. He was not a saint. He was not a monster. He was, more than anything else, a person. A real, whole, contradictory, courageous, difficult, generous person who lived a long life in front of a lot of cameras and who, in the end, went home and closed the door and became quiet. Thank you for spending this time with him. And with me. I hope, wherever he is, he would not mind too much that we told the story this way. I like to think he would appreciate that we tried, at least, to tell it honestly. That is the one thing, I suspect, his mother taught him all those years ago that he never really stopped believing. Do not come back to me ordinary. By any reasonable measure of a human life, he did not.